There are many, many types of pumps in the world today. Pumps are the second most common mechanical device in the world, motors being number one. But every pump has a motor generally. And although there are all kinds of different types of pumps, and I'm going to talk about different ones, let's start with the most common one, which is also the simplest one, which is the centrifugal pump. So the centrifugal pump dates back to the 1700s, actually, and it's really a motor with a wheel. That's the simplest definition of a centrifugal pump. It's a motor that has a shaft that sticks out, and you attach a impeller. The common used word for something that throws water, a propeller, because we all have seen propellers in water that create thrust. But in a pump, we don't say propeller, we say impeller. And the impeller throws water using centrifugal force. And to illustrate that, you might think of how your tire in the rain, as you're moving forward, the wheel throws water up and onto the wheel well of your car. It picks up water and tosses it. So that is basically what centrifugal force is when it comes to moving water. You're throwing water. Now the vanes of the impeller, they're not digging at the water to grab it. The water is coming in through the eye of the impeller onto the back of this curved part of the impeller, and it is throwing the water with centrifugal force, all happening within the cavity of what we call the volute of the pump. But inside there, it's throwing the water and it's being forced out a discharge to wherever it's being guided to. So centrifugal force is throwing water as opposed to pushing water. Many pumps push water, and they're called positive displacement pumps. They positively displace the water from where it is, and they keep doing that. A plunger type pump does that sort of thing. A diaphragm pump will do that sort of thing. It's pushing the water as opposed to throwing. Soft impellers that collapse and close the area inside the volute, pushing the water out. That's positive displacement. And they have different physical characteristics about that you'll learn about later that you want to be aware of, that are more appropriate in certain applications than others. But for our purposes here, what we want to know about is, and note, is the difference between centrifugal movement of water and positive force of positive displacement. Okay, well, another type of pump, variation of the centrifugal pump, is called the self-priming pump. Because a problem that nags centrifugal pumps is if somehow air gets into the system and comes in on the inlet of the pump, when that air hits the center, the eye of the impeller of a centrifugal pump, it creates a vacuum and expands out, and the impeller is just a wheel that's spinning there doing nothing, and the pump gets airlocked. Well, how do you get rid of that air? Well, you need somewhere for that air to rise up vertically and get off the impeller. So you have to create an area above the impeller. And when pumps are designed that way, they're called self-priming. So they can start with just say a pipe that goes down 10 feet into a tank or something and has what we call a check valve on the bottom, a foot valve, that allows water to only go one way. And that pump will start forcing the air out very slowly, but it will create a vacuum until that water gets pulled up into the pump. And then it will force that air out once the water comes and fills the impeller, and it can expel the air. Whereas if it's a more efficient but not self-priming volute, you run the risk of the air getting airlocked in there. And what you have to do is turn the system off and bleed the air out and refill it with water, and it's a big hassle. So thus the whole genre of self-priming pumps. And these are common in lots of residential areas where people who have their own water well are pulling water from a shallow, and they need to have that self-priming feature. Jet pumps are typically self-priming pumps. And what jet pumps do, which is another variation of the centrifugal pump and variation of the self-priming pump, what they do is they circulate water. And as they're shoving, the jet pumps water down, and it makes a U-turn, and as it does, with a special inlet valve down in the bottom, it makes a U-turn, and as it does, it creates a vacuum and pulls water up with it. Imagine if you shoved a hose down into a tube and pointed it upwards and turned the water on. It would blast whatever water is in there plus what it's pushing on its own. And with that physical principle in mind, jet pumps can pull water up from not too deep, but most efficiently anywhere up to 100, 200 feet, depending on the horsepower and so forth, the design of the pump. But jet pumps are another type of pump that are very common. Okay, so back to positive displacement pumps. You'll find in many applications, especially in industry, you have diaphragms that pump the water positively by just simply reciprocating and pushing water out, and as they come out they suck water back in, and then it pushes it out again. A variation of that is a plunger pump. If you've ever seen oil wells with those big grasshopper looking things that go up and down, well, they are operating a plunger that as it pushes down, it pushes water up, and as it comes up, it sucks water back into the cavity, and then as it comes down, it pushes water up. And that's what those things are doing. And they are basically exactly like a windmill. The wind blows the windmill around, and which causes what we call a sucker rod to go up and down, and it's operating a plunger up and down, and that's positive displacement. Another type of pump that's very common is a submersible pump. Now, there's lots of pumps that are submerged in water. And by the way, sometimes people use the term submergible pumps. Well, submersible is a little bit more common, at least these days. And anytime you have a sump where water collects, and so you build you dig a sump and you put a little pump in there, and it's going to, whenever it fills up, it's going to pump the water out. That's a submersible type pump. And they can be little coffee can sized things on up to, 40, 50 horsepower. And they're used often for sewage pits and dewatering pits, but they're very, very common, and as I said, they can be all sizes, from just pumping out your pool to what we call multiplex systems that have several pumps that alternate to do the job of a big sewage station. but they all are operating on the same basic principle of centrifugal force with an impeller, and it's throwing water out. And that, of course, is the type of pump you need for a submersible water well. If you have water that's 300 feet down, you're not going to be able to get it with a self-priming pump. It's too deep, or a jet pump. So you have to put a pump down in the water and submerge it. And it has a motor on the bottom, and then the pump is attached to the top, and the water comes in where the motor attaches to the pump. Water comes in and is pushed up by a stack of impellers. And the more impellers you have, the higher up you can pump that water. The size of the vane of the impeller, the thickness of the impeller itself, determines how much water is being pumped. 5 gallons or 50 gallons. Could be a big, thick thing. But the amount of impellers that you stack adds to what we call the head that it can pump up vertically. So when you're using many impellers, we call that multi-stage, a multi-stage pump. Some of them are submersible, some of them are above ground, and they're used in different ways throughout industry. And then finally, another major category would be turbine pumps. Turbine pumps you will see in agricultural fields all the time. You see a motor that's sitting vertically, and beneath that what you have is a long shaft that goes down maybe hundreds and hundreds of feet. And at the bottom you have your centrifugal pump, or many stages of centrifugal pump. And the water comes in down there, and then they push the water all the way up using a shaft that goes all the way down from the motor above ground. And having the motor above ground allows you to access the motor if it needs replacement or repair. So that covers some of the most general categories of types of pumps. We, of course, are going to go into a lot more detail on the many types of pumps and how they're all used.